The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. Last week we concluded, after strenuous efforts, chapter 2 on the question, does fine-tuning for life point to intelligence? And that's basically physics. Now we're on chapter 3. Is theism more rational than atheism? Now he's getting into metaphysics in Thomas Aquinas. And essentially what he's doing in this chapter is rehearsing Thomas's 5 ways of knowing that God exists, primarily through efficient causality, but also through formal design. And his language, as I'll point out as we go through it, some of his language, I think, is intentionally a modern expression of what Thomas said in a different way. So let us dive in.
Yeah, well, I love the way that, again, there's a structure to it, which is almost, I mean, it's a work of physics and metaphysics, but it's also literary. So he begins the chapter with setting up Richard Dawkins's thesis in the God Delusion, that so on page 91, the thesis thing, whatever is more complex is more improbable. A cosmic design of God must be more complex than anything it designs. Therefore, a cosmic designer must be more improbable than anything it designs. So that's the logic of Richard Dawkins, of course, international bestseller, The God Delusion. So this shows how bad ideas can have bad consequences. But what he then does in the chapter is basically show, on the contrary, that God is the most simple of beings, in the sense of not being complex, not having parts. He basically debunks Richard Dawkins throughout the course of it. And I think, if I remember correctly, he concludes the article by reminding us that he's debunked Richard Dawkins.
Yes.
And that, when I was studying metaphysics, was one of the concepts which I found most difficult, because, I mean, God is the author of things that are complex, must also be complex, right? Well, actually not right, if you think it through philosophically, as Aquinas did and as Father Spitzer does. But just like none of our concepts apply adequately to God, there's a thing called negative theology or apophatic theology and cataphatic, where you say, well, God is just, or God is Father. But he's not like our justice or like our fatherhood. He's not less, he's more, but he's infinitely more. So even though we say God is simple, he doesn't mean simple in our simplistic way. It reminds me, as a teenager, I was on a boat on the Tenaya River, I think it was called, in Juneau, Alaska. And our guide was an Eskimo named Peter Simple. And I said, Peter, what's the origin of your name? So when the missionaries came, they baptized my grandparents and others, and they kind of gave names which they thought were appropriate. So they called my granddad Simple. So that's why I'm called Simple. So God can be called simple also, but it's not like Peter Simple, or it's not like normal simple.
Well, and that brings up an important point, especially in conversations like the one we're having about defining your terms, right? What is simple? What does the word simple mean? And once Father, because I too was stumped, like, how could God be more simple than what he makes? I thought God's always
More.
Yes. And then you find out, but if simplicity has to do with not multiple parts and not, when he starts spelling out what simple really means, then you're like, oh, now I get it. Now I see how God is simple.
The word, if we're talking about a first cause, we use the word primal, right? If something is primal, right, it's going to be more simple, right, than something which is not primal, right, which something comes after it. So you can see that whatever is first is going to be primal, right? And of course, we don't really understand what that means, but it's going to be less complex than the things that come from it.
Yes, and he goes into this in great detail. I liked it very much, that the idea that existence as a reality is not limited. I mean, existence is existence, right? And if you're ever going to have something which exists, a book, that's a limitation on existence. That's only a part of what can exist. And since God is the one who is the originator of everything which is limited, it's existing, all right, but it's a limited existing. He can't be limited because he's got to be able to make everything else which is limited. So
yeah, exactly. So there are words that sort of that perhaps sort of suggest. So I mentioned primal, but another word that suggests this is absolute, right? If God is absolute, then there's something about him which is in some sense simple, right? You can't get beyond it, and there's everything else is less than it. But it's not loads of different things. It's absolute, right?
And we're constantly having to correct ourselves, our mental thinking, because we cannot help ourselves from thinking of God as a thing, even a person or three persons. But still, for us, persons are tangible, limited realities, right? But God is not the greatest thing among all the other things. God is beyond things and beyond even our kind of being. By the way, one of the great philosophers on this is Plotinus, who wasn't a Christian. In fact, he fought the Christians, but he really had a very, very strong understanding and way of expressing it of God's otherness. In fact, he would call God non-being, insofar as not like nothingness, but what we call being is so inferior to what God is that it might as well be called non-being with respect to God.
Well, in the last session, you mentioned how God revealed himself to Moses as I am, this really metaphysical understanding of being. But then in the Shema of Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And thinking about now simple, absolute, these are the words, suddenly it's dawning on me that expression is also one of these earth-shattering expressions like I am, in that he's not simply saying there is one God and I am he. When he says I am one, what is more simple than that? So you realize that this has to be divine revelation that's coming to us through what he revealed to the Jewish people. And these expressions that, you hear it goes in one ear, out the other, heard that a million times. But then when you stop to consider, that's what God said. I am, boom. I am one, boom.
And it's shocking enough for Moses to hear it from a voice coming out of the burning bush. But when, as Chestnut would describe him, a young Galilean laborer walking through the streets of Jerusalem turns and says, by the way, I am. I mean, that's...
Before Abraham was.
Are you nuts?
Yeah, before Abraham was, I am. What kind of sentence is that?
Right.
Yeah.
And I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah.
I am the bread of life.
Well, it was also, the young Bernadette was criticized when she said that this lady said, I'm the Immaculate Conception. That's bad grammar, And they said, well, she got it from her son.
That's good. Oh, boy. Well, look at all the things that reading this sort of thing provokes in you when you have to consider these things. That's why reading books, even when they're hard, is a good idea.
At the beginning of this chat, one thing I do want to just point out before we sort of plow on is that we've moved from physics to metaphysics, right? From physical sciences to philosophy. Yet he does, on page 92, make it clear that the two have one thing in common, right? They're subject to reason. There are only three ways of proving the truth or falsity of any claim, right? This applies to physics and metaphysics. Observable evidence, intrinsic contradiction, and a proposition that can be shown to be contradictory to fact. So these are the three tests, the three litmus tests, shall we say? These are going to apply to the metaphysical arguments now, as he applied them basically to the physical arguments in the previous chapter.
Yes. Another side note.
But he concludes, though, that none of those three things can be used to disprove God.
Right.
Right.
Like you can't disprove God using that method. Exactly.
That's kind of a soft approach, saying, I'm not going to say I can prove God exists.
That's right.
But I'm going to say you can't prove he doesn't.
That's right.
A little historical note. We speak of physics and metaphysics, and we see metaphysics as transcendental philosophical, and that is true. But that's not the origin. Of the origin. Aristotle wrote a book called Physics, on the physical. And we finished that. He wrote a second book, which was metaphysics. That is, meta means after physics. It's the book he wrote after the book he wrote on physics.
Oh, not above physics.
Yeah, but it happens to be above physics. But historically, it just happens to be the one.
Oh.
It was the sequel to physics, so to speak.
Oh, really? Oh, my goodness.
Physics writes again. Page 95 here, because if I can read this, because I think that what we just said, this is where he succinctly shows how atheism is not rational.
Okay.
So the existence of God, it's just over halfway down, the existence of God defined as a unique, uncaused, unrestricted creator for all else that exists, cannot be disproved through any method. Therefore, atheism cannot be rationally proved, and hence is not a rationally justifiable belief. In contrast to this, the existence of God can be rationally proved because at least one uncaused reality is required for anything to exist, and unrestrictedness, uniqueness, and being creator are necessarily entailed by an uncaused reality, as you shall see in the proof below in section 2. Therefore, theism is a rationally justifiable belief. So, first of all, it's absolutely, I would say that, and I agree with both, but I would think that people might scratch their heads and wonder about whether you can prove theism. But no one's going to wonder about the fact that you can't prove atheism, right? It's quite clearly an irrational belief that requires faith, and not faith rooted in reason, but actually ultimately faith rooted in a desire that God not exist.
Right. And that's what we saw, remember, when we discussed the drama of atheist humanism, that atheism was a chosen path for some of the, for Nietzsche and some of the others, a chosen path.
It's basically a fallacious effort to explain the existence of God away, and it doesn't work.
Vivian, in your desire to illustrate the idea of the number 2, did you take my pencil?
I did, maybe. I don't know. Which one was yours?
I thought I brought one in. So
that probably is it.
Okay. All right. I underlined very little here because nothing stood out too much to me. It's a beautiful exposition of Thomas's argument, and I thought it was well done.
Which Joseph pretty much summed up in the section, in the graph that he just read, because if you just go through the main numbered points through the outline,
and you're saying that he repeats himself, and I've also highlighted the conclusion or a paragraph on page 100. But as you say, it just does really repeat what he says at the beginning, which we've just read. So I don't know if we need to read it again.
Well, read your highlighted if you want.
Well, let me just at the end of all the discussion there, page 100, before you get to the end of this section A, conclusion. Therefore, there must exist one and only one uncaused, unrestricted reality that is the creator of everything else in existence. To say otherwise requires you to argue a contradiction, an impossibility, or to deny the existence of everything, including yourself. The unique, uncaused, unrestricted creator is referred to as God. Therefore, God, as defined, exists. I mean, very succinct, very good.
It's been interesting to observe, we think of Hinduism, for example, as a polytheistic religion. and yet, like if you watch Bollywood movies or read things by Hindu authors or whatever, how often they refer to God, period, as when they're referring to something like providentially has happened. They thank God, they bless God, they say God bless you. And so even when you have cultures that had multiple deities, often local deities and things like that, nevertheless, there arrives just naturally, but there has to be something that's even beyond these things.
Chesterton talks about this in The Everlasting Man, about the Australian Aborigines, and even in Homer, I mean, I think polytheism really is a belief that there are lots of supernatural beings. Well, we believe that. We call them angels and demons, right?
That's right.
But there's still this sense of above all polytheism is God. So I mean, there's this wonderful scene in the Iliad where all the gods are assembled on Mount Olympus, and Zeus says to all of them, all the other gods, that if we had a tug of war, and I was one end of the rope, and all of you were the other end of the rope, I would win, and none of them contradict him. I mean, that metaphorically is basically a confession on Homer's part of monotheism.
And again, one of the concepts which I thought was genial, it may have existed before Chesterton, but certainly he employed it and elaborated on it, was that this idea that that polytheism comes first in the mind of man, and then over time you're more sophisticated and you get to monism or monotheism. He says, no, he says that what's common to what's most deep in the mind of man is the idea of some one thing out there that's in charge of it all. But in my village, we call him Sam, and now we get conquered by you, and your God you call Willie, Oh, well, now we got Sam and Willie. You believe in one God, you call him Willie, how about Sam? And so he sees polytheism as a melting pot of a lot of monotheisms that historically came together because of assimilation and conquest. And
well, that's what the Pantheon in Rome was for.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Let's just put everybody's gods in here and make it just one big happy family.
One big unhappy family.
Anyway.
Well, the next thing, I don't have anything highlighted to page 115 for what it's worth.
All right. Let's see. As I said, I didn't underline much.
Well, here's another note I think that adds to the simple, this defining of terms, right? Whether God is simple. And I loved on the top of 102 where Father Spitzer defines what the word perfect really means, that nothing can be added to it. So, when we use these words, it's sometimes helpful to think, what does that word really even mean? When we say something is perfect, a painting, a meal, although anything that we make never really is perfect, but when it gets pretty darn close, what we mean is not one more thing could have been added to that painting to make it any better, or that poem, or that stew, right? And I just never really thought about, okay, perfection really is a simple thing. It's a completeness.
Yes. Now, there's another kind of perfection. When the Father says, be perfect as I am perfect, that doesn't mean we should be totally complete as much as God is.
Because we can't be.
But rather, he makes his rain fall upon the just and the unjust. To be perfect in the Christian sense is to be self-forgetful, to be totally outside of yourself, ecstatically, as it were, and giving yourself to God and to others. But anyway, that's...
I also think, when we're called to be Christ-like, we know that we can't be perfect as Christ is perfect. But I think what you need is the goal of perfection, the goal of the absolute good, the perfect, to aim at. Because without this absolute mark, you don't know, you're going to be disoriented, you're going to be going in different directions. So we know what the perfect is, it's Jesus Christ, and insofar as we are doing our best to be as much like him as possible, we are becoming closer to perfection without, of course, ever being perfect.
Yes.
This is also related to the transcendental of beauty, You know, when we say a piece of music is perfect, or what we're saying is it's also beautiful. At the Asian Art Museum here in San Francisco, there's this big rock that's been carved out of the middle, and it's filled to the brim with water, and there's a bench across from it. And as I was going through the museum, I thought, wonder what that's all about. Well, I'll sit down and find out. I'll sit down and find out what's supposed to happen here. So I sit down and I start looking. And sure enough, if you had put one more drop of water, it would have overflowed. So in other words, this vessel has reached its perfection because it's completely and totally full. And if you kind of like, you know how, what's that thing called?
Meniscus.
Yeah, there's like a meniscus, just the slightest meniscus. And I'm telling you, the feeling of peace that comes over you when you are in the presence of something that has reached its perfection, it's completely full. Not one more drop of water would fit in this vessel.
Yeah. So to disturb the water would be a violation.
And there is a peace that comes from the beauty, the perfection, the tranquility. It's all wrapped up together in this experience of just sitting there and looking at a rock full of water. So other cultures, other peoples apprehend this connection between what perfection is, what order and tranquility are, what beauty is, and how they're somehow all connected, and what that brings to the human person who stops to contemplate it.
So, again, speaking as a Christian here, I mean, there's one human being, merely human, who was perfect, Mary. And you wonder, we all have fallen from the norm. What is the norm? The norm is the idea God had of us when he created us, what we were meant to be. And we all fall short of that in many different ways. Adrian von Speyer says that one of the writers of Purgatory, it's the moment when you meet Christ at the moment of death, and you see in him what you were supposed to be and how far you've fallen from that and how painful that will be, to recognize what I became, what I should have become. But here's to me the question. I'm getting closer and closer to the answer because I'm pretty old now. To what extent will we be restored and healed towards what we were supposed to have been? And I don't know the answer to that. But as I say, I'm going to find out.
Isn't that one of the promises, though, that we will be restored when we reach the end? That this will be God will. What does St. Paul say? God will bring to completion the work he has begun in you.
Yes, but I think it's like the glorified wounds. The wounds don't disappear, but they're glorified. And I think my sins don't disappear either. But because they repented.
Let's be presumptuous. I can be presumptuous on your behalf, right? And that, I'm assuming.
Yeah, because you don't know what's going on inside.
It's not a sin. I'm going to presume on your behalf that you're going to go to heaven. That's not a sin because I'm saying it of you. If you get there, then you will be perfected. But of course, to be perfected, it's not going to be the Father Fessio who's 27 years old and super fit who could cycle from Chicago to LA.
So give up on that idea right now.
It's got to be.
I've been there. I don't want to be that again anyway.
Anyway, it's going to be a perfection which is far transcends and supersedes that. I mean, in the Last Battle, I mean, one of my favorite visions of heaven is the final pages of the Last Battle by C.S. Lewis, when they're running uphill and no one gets out of breath. They're going faster and faster. No one gets out of breath. So all of the things that are part of what we are as fallen, finite beings in a broken cosmos won't be there any longer.
Well, and my favorite last chapter of C.S. Lewis is Pearlandra, which is the cosmic heavenly dance, where there's this intermingling of people, and here are the elves bowing to the carrot, and over there the carrot's bowing to Our Lady, and we're all bowing to each other, all part of the process. But I guess my point is that I think if any of us had lived in complete conformity with the will of God, I think our eternal destiny would have been superior to what is going to be. I think because we've sinned, we'll never have that fullness of perfection we would have had we not sinned. But that doesn't mean we're not going to have a perfection and a healing and a I would say what should I say here a flowering. I mean, Paul says this is a great thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, around verse 35. He says, "Now some of you are asking what the risen body is like." That's a stupid question.
Yeah, he does say that.
He says that's a foolish question. And what does he give us? He says, our bodies are like a seed planted in the ground, and you don't know what it's going to be. Like you take a seed, you can't tell it's going to be a rose or a carrot or what, unless you look at the package. But that's because someone saw it before. But if all we saw was a seed for the first time, we wouldn't know what's going to happen to that. That goes into the ground, and what becomes of it is marvelous, far beyond what was put into the ground, right? So that's his image. So even though we have our failings and our sins, I believe that the heavenly glory will be what no eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor has it entered the mind of man.
Amen. And also the whole idea of a hierarchy. The communion of saints being a hierarchy. I'm not expected to be on the same level as a Blessed Virgin or Saint Peter.
That's
So
right.
obviously, what I am as a person is going to be reflected to where I am in the hierarchy
Yeah.
when I get to heaven.
I'm going to be in the lowerarchy.
Whatever shape your cup is in, though, it will be full.
That's right. My little thimble will be full. I have I'm making cheese as well as bread, and when you make cheese, you have to put the culture in 1/16th, 1/32nd, 1/64th of a teaspoon.
Oh my
And
goodness!
so I've got this little set of little spoons that goes down to 1/64th. I think 1/128th actually.
Oh my heavens!
And that'll be me. All right. We're close to running out of time.
Yeah. I'm still at 115, which is just before the conclusion of the chapter. If you want to fast forward,
Sure. Well,
it's up to you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's just I want to just sort of maybe finish things here the way we started with Dawkins's thesis for the God delusion, which I say was a million-selling international bestseller with very bad consequences. And then 5 lines down on page 115, we must now return to Dawkins's argument. If, as Dawkins correctly says, more complex realities are more improbable, and if an uncaused reality must, in its unrestricted existence, be absolutely simple, the complete absence of parts and therefore complexity, then God, by Dawkins' own argument, would have to be the most probable reality of all. So what's brilliant about that is he basically says that in Dawkins, in trying to disprove the existence of God, has actually proved the existence of God.
Yes.
And it really should be an invitation to Dawkins. I don't know if he ever, if anyone's ever pointed this out to him, to actually revisit his own presumptions.
And I want to point out here that he uses unrestricted a lot, or restricted existence. And that's a way of expressing Aquinas' distinction between essence and existence, because essence is a restriction. What you are means you've got a definition, a limit. You're not everything else, right? And so God is existence who creates essences, things which are limited, but to do that, he must himself be unrestricted. Therefore, he doesn't have an essence. He's beyond essence. Anything else?
Well, I mean, we could try to just finish chapter 3. I mean, I've got things. I don't know if I need to. I've already done more. I can quote from the right at the end on page 120 if you want. If you want to fast forward to there and finish chapter 3 today.
Well, it's up to you too.
If not, I don't mind if we don't. If you've got things you want to talk about, we can come back and do it next time.
Sure. Okay. Good.
No, I don't have anything pressing to talk about.
We're talking about the ultimately simple, and so we've been very simple too. And go ahead, Joseph.
So just it might be a nice way to finish. So he mentions St. John Henry Newman at the top of page 120, and it's sort of the sort of line of reasoning that St. John Henry Newman uses in his book, The Aid of a Grammar of Assent, and in other words, taking the various different disciplines and the various and put them all together as something which is probable, a probable truth, and then a combination of probable truths, like gathering all the evidence. And he says, and then right at the end of the chapter there, as will be seen, the assemblage has considerable probative force to validate the existence of God, a transcendent soul, and the likelihood of life after death. The complementarity and mutual corroboration of the scientific method, metaphysical method, peer-reviewed medical studies, and studies in the philosophy of mind and religious experience point strongly to this conclusion. So having proved what he's already done through physics and metaphysics, he's now going to bring in medical and scientific evidence to suggest or prove the existence of a transcendent soul, and that's the topic of chapter 4.
I must say, I don't think I've ever seen a book like this that brings in all these seemingly disparate approaches, all to look at the same thing. It goes back to your reference to von Balthasar looking at the David.
Oh, yes.
Right? And needing to look at it from all these different angles to really grasp it. And even then, you can't really grasp it because you can't see the whole thing all at once. So, but the more angles you look at it from, the bigger picture will come into view. And that's what he's doing. I didn't think about that before.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Thomas, for your faithful service over there. We'll see you at the next session. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.